So if you do an appraisal of Modi government's performance vis-a-vis the civil society, it's going to be a very, very depressing picture. The last 1 year has been extremely difficult for civil society, and this is not just rhetoric. Let me explain. There are at least three very specific instances which tell us that the Modi government is certainly looking at the civil society very unkindly, and that's a very polite term. I would really say that this is a fairly well orchestrated, thought through attempt to squeeze the civil society. And those three specific things that I would want to mention. The first one is the Intelligence Bureau report on civil society being leaked, which was never fully owned by the Intelligence Bureau, but they did not even refute the fact that it's done by Intelligence Bureau, where the report said that there are a lot of organizations which work against development, and then linking an alternative perspective on development, a people's perspective on development, a green perspective on development, with the idea that it's anti-national. The second has been the onslaught against Greenpeace. Greenpeace certainly is an activist organization. It has raised a very, very strong voice against certain private interests, but the government has come down heavily on them, and very often, and which we've already seen through the High Court intervention, that it's been illegal in terms of what the government did, including the ban on Priya Pillai flying out of the country. And the third is a broader narrative of banning almost, now I'm told there are 17 donor agencies, which include well-known entities like the Ford Foundation, but interestingly, even a bilateral agency like Delita. These have been banned from giving funds in India. And obviously there are different degrees of ban. For a Greenpeace, they can't give funds in India. For Ford Foundation, they're saying they're in the prior permission list, so the Ford Foundation needs to go to government for each grant. So you can clearly see a pattern in which the space for, I would say, civic action by civil society groups has been curbed. And if you look at also the way the media has responded, and that's largely, I would say, by the discourse that the government is setting, it's trying to say that the sector is unaccountable, thrives on foreign money, and because it challenges a particular paradigm of economic development, is anti-national. So that's how I would look at this 1 year of the government, and therefore civil society groups, common citizens, political groups all need to challenge this squeezing of the civic space. And I hope government also immediately changes this crackdown on the dissenting and civic space. We really cannot distinguish between the NDA government and the UPA government. So it's the UPA government which started many of these initiatives. So in fact, the IB report that I mentioned was actually written during the times of the UPA government. It was only leaked in the NDA government. If you look at how the FCRA law was changed, where every 5 years groups need to go for a renewal, that happened in 2010, again UPA regime. Look at what happened in Kodalkalam, where anti-sedition or sedition charges have been framed against activists. So it's just that UPA was also doing it. Probably it was a little more subdued, and this government is doing it in a far more in-your-face way. An immediate trigger, Anna movement certainly was one of the factors where the political class felt extremely threatened by people working in the civic spaces. The feeling that people working in civic spaces can make serious political dents has been an apprehension which has now become a reality for the political class. So I would agree with you that that's one of the triggers. But I would also say that this is how the Indian narrative is unfolding at the moment, where we are trying to build hegemony of ideas, particularly around a neoliberal framework of development, a particular idea of state, a particular idea of economic GDP growth led model. So all dissenting voices are seen not just as irritants, but as fundamentally opposed to this project. And therefore, the idea of democracy it gets sidetracked. The fundamental principles of democracy are not as relevant, and the government and the political establishment, the elite establishment, would try and crush any of these alternative dissenting voices. And just to add to this, I think that what is very important is that serious challenges to this dominant paradigm, which post 91 has been the dominant paradigm of this country, is essentially coming from the civic spaces, from civil society. Left, which should have traditionally played this role, has also been very ineffective in raising fundamental questions. So a serious challenge to a hegemonic development of neoliberalism is coming from civil society, and therefore the crackdown is also severe. And I feel therefore it's going to continue to become harsher. Civil society also needs to reorient itself. At some level, I feel worried that many of us got far more into the engagement mode, wanting to do advocacy, directly engaging with the policy making apparatus and systems. I think it's a critical moment where civil society goes back to its fundamental role of organizing and mobilizing people, certainly in a completely non-violent way, certainly within the constitutional mechanisms, but organize, mobilize people, build people's power to help them articulate their own aspirations. Our initial reading of the situation was that this is going to be a serious crackdown on groups which essentially work on the issues of Jal Jangal Zameen, as I was earlier talking of a particular GDP-led growth model. So anybody working on Adivasi rights, working against displacement, are the ones who would be hit first and hit hardest, and that's what is happening. But when you look at the way 17 of these donor agencies have been stopped from functioning freely in this country, it's very clear that it is not just the Jal Jangal Zameen groups or the very radical groups. I think the problem is with a particular kind of civil society, which comes from, I would say, broadly a left liberal space. And that's where the real contest is happening. So yes, it started with radical groups, but I don't see it stopping here. It will continue and it will go on to many other groups, whoever is challenging the fundamental ideology of the current regime. And when I said current regime, even the previous regime, as I was saying, was not very different. And mind you, they will constantly talk about, on the one hand, as I said, anti-development narrative, therefore anti-national. On the other hand, questions about accountability of the civil society sector. But let me say that nobody who's talking of the right to associate or right for civic action is saying that we should not be accountable. In fact, I've been constantly saying probably we should be several steps ahead of what the government or the laws ask us to be. If the RTI doesn't get applied to us, but we should voluntarily comply with RTI and so on. So it's really not an accountability question. It is a question of people's ability to organize and have a dissenting